My name is Loretta, and I am 66 years old. I've lived a long life, not extraordinary, not tragic, just full. I was a secretary once, back when offices smelled like carbon paper and perfume. I married young, like many of us did back then, and stayed married longer than I should have. 3 decades to be exact. My husband passed away 6 years ago. A quiet death in a hospice room after a noisy life filled with demands. I grieved, yes, but I also felt something I wasn't supposed to feel, a quiet sort of relief. No more shouting, no more being made to feel small for asking to be heard. After that, I sold the house. It was too big, too empty, too full of ghosts I'd stopped missing. I moved in with my son, Jason, his wife, Amy, and their 2 children. It was meant to be temporary, just until I figured things out. But you know how these things go. Temporary became convenient. Convenient became permanent. And permanent became silent. They offered me the guest room, which had a view of the neighbor's fence and a sliver of sky if you leaned just right. I took it gratefully. Amy said it would be good for the kids to have their grandma around, and I thought, yes, maybe this is my new role, to help, to support, to be of use. And so I became a part of their house, not a part of the family the way I used to be, but a part of the house, like the kettle, or the laundry basket, or the clock that ticks in the hallway and no one listens to unless it stops. I cook breakfast every morning: toast, eggs, oatmeal if it's cold. I pick up toys from the floor, fold laundry that isn't mine, refill empty toilet rolls, and wipe smudges from glass doors no one else seems to notice. I keep the fridge stocked and the calendar full of dentist appointments and PTA meetings. When Amy got promoted and started working longer hours, I stepped in even more. School pickups, science projects, ballet recitals, flu season, sleepovers. I was there, always. I never asked for anything. Not really. I didn't want to be a burden. I told myself I was grateful. I told myself that being useful meant being loved. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the house, really alone, when the dishwasher hums and the wind makes the maple trees whisper outside the window, I say my name out loud, just to remember I still have one. Loretta. Because most days I answer to Mom, Grandma, can you, or did you? There's nothing wrong, I would have said, if someone had asked. I'm just tired, that's all. But no one asked. And then there was dinner. It was a Thursday, which meant spaghetti. I had started the sauce before lunch because it always tastes better after it simmers for hours. I chopped onions and browned the meat. I added the basil Jason likes and a pinch of sugar the way my mother taught me. The kitchen smelled like home, or at least what home used to smell like. They came home late, bustling in with grocery bags and phone calls, and I set the table while Amy scrolled through her emails. The kids were loud. Jason had a meeting to rush to after dinner. Amy was annoyed the dishwasher hadn't been emptied, even though I had done it already, just not the way she prefers. But I smiled. I served. I refilled glasses, and when we all sat down, I told myself, as I always did, that this was enough, that being here mattered, that my presence, even quiet and worn, meant something. And then Jason raised his glass. I don't remember exactly what we were laughing about. Probably something the youngest grandchild had said, a mispronounced word, or a wild story about dinosaurs on the moon. That's usually what brought noise to the table, the sort that hides fatigue and irritations beneath shallow amusement. The plates were filled, steam rising from the spaghetti I'd carefully layered with fresh parsley and just enough grated parmesan. My hands smelled faintly of garlic and soap. I sat finally across from Jason, my fork poised politely over the meal. And then, out of nowhere, Jason stood and tapped his glass. It was the kind of gesture he had always made when trying to reclaim attention from the chaos. A birthday, an announcement, a fatherly joke. But tonight, it wasn't any of those. His tone was light but deliberate. I just want to raise a glass, he said, his voice catching slightly above the clatter of cutlery. To real women. Amy looked up and smiled. Jason went on, to the kind of women who don't make demands, who don't need the spotlight, who quietly support everyone else without asking for applause, who don't make a fuss when things aren't perfect, who are just reliable. He looked directly at me, not a glance, a look, and in that moment something inside me slowed. Amy tilted her glass and smirked gently. The kids were busy twirling pasta. No one saw the sting, not even Jason, who took a sip of wine and sat back down as if he'd said something noble. I didn't smile. I didn't raise my glass. I set down my fork. I had heard many things in that house over the years. Tantrums, apologies, dismissals, praises not meant for me. But this was something different. This was an outline being drawn right in front of me, and I was being asked to live inside it. To be a real woman by his measure meant to stay quiet, to carry the load, to not mind the absence of thank yous, to not flinch when your name isn't spoken. I looked down at my plate. The steam had stopped rising. I remember the sound of the ticking clock in the hallway and the dishwasher beeping, finished. I remember Amy asking the youngest not to flick sauce onto her dress. I remember Jason saying something about how women like Amy and like me were what held families together. I remember all of it blending together into a moment I would never forget. I stood up, not abruptly, not with drama, just enough to not be mistaken for reaching for a napkin. And I walked away from the table. They didn't stop me. Jason cleared his throat and started telling a story from work. Amy cut the crusts off the little one's garlic bread. The room did not pause for my exit. I stood in the hallway. The light was dimmer there, soft and faded, like the edges of old photos. I heard them behind me, laughing, chewing, living, and for the first time, I realized I could leave the room and nothing would stop moving. They hadn't seen me leave, not really, because they hadn't been seeing me for a long time. They saw usefulness. They saw familiarity. They saw the dinner. But they didn't see me. I went to the kitchen sink and rinsed my hands. The water was warm. I stared out the window above the basin. The yard was dark, the porch light humming. The swing swayed in the wind. I stayed there a long time. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. I was just quiet. And inside that silence, something shifted. Not a crack, not a scream, a movement, a pivot. Something was over, but not in a way they would notice. Not yet. That night, I didn't return to the dinner table. No one came looking. I heard the scrape of chairs being pushed back, the murmur of post-dinner cleanup. Someone dropped a fork. A child whined about bedtime. Amy reminded Jason to take out the trash. Life moved on as if the woman who had simmered the sauce, folded the napkins, and wiped sticky handprints from the counter had simply ceased to exist. I stood in the hallway for a long time before retreating to my room. My steps made no sound over the carpet. I closed the door softly, not out of courtesy, but because anything louder would have felt like asking for attention. My room was always cold in the evening. I pulled the thin blanket over my knees and sat on the bed. I didn't turn on the light. The glow from the hallway under the door was enough. I listened. For what? I'm not sure. Maybe for a knock, a voice, even the smallest question. Mom, are you okay? It never came. I used to think silence was a kindness, a sort of nobility. My mother had taught me that, to be polite, unobtrusive, accommodating, to listen more than I speak, to never burden anyone with needs they hadn't volunteered to meet. But that night, in the quiet hum of the house I helped keep running, I saw silence differently. Not noble, not kind, just invisible. They didn't hear the absence of my voice. They didn't feel the weight of my footsteps missing from the hall. They didn't notice that the woman who woke up early to pack lunches and stayed up late folding laundry had fallen still. And somehow, that absence was louder than any words I could have spoken. I thought about how many times I had been the first to rise, the last to sit, and the only one who noticed what was missing: a lunchbox, a clean towel, a kind word. And how often I had told myself, this is what mothers do, this is what grandmothers are for. I sat there and watched the clock change. 9:30, 10, 10:15. Each minute ticked like a reminder, not of time passing, but of time spent unnoticed. At 10:20, I rose, slowly, no rush. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. A neighbor's television flickered in a living room across the way. A cat padded across the sidewalk, chasing nothing in particular. The world was moving. It always was. Somewhere, dishes were being dried, lights flicked off, children were tucked in. A woman like me was probably sitting in another house, just as silent, just as invisible, wondering if her presence was ever really seen at all. I whispered my name again, Loretta, and I realized I hadn't heard it spoken with softness in a long time. Not with affection, not with curiosity, not even with recognition. Just orders, just reminders, just expectation. I turned away from the window and looked at the suitcase in my closet. Not a big one, just the one I used years ago for weekends at the lake. I hadn't touched it since moving in with Jason and Amy. Everything I needed was here, they said. I didn't need to go anywhere. But now I wasn't so sure. I walked over to it, rested my hand on the handle. It felt cool, unfamiliar, like a version of myself I hadn't spoken to in years. I lay down, eyes open in the dark, listening to the sounds of a house that didn't notice my absence. A house that had learned to take and forget to ask. In that moment, I decided something, not out of anger, not even sadness, just clarity. I would wait. One more day, maybe two, but I wouldn't stay longer than I had already been ignored. Not again. The next morning, I woke before the sun. It was still dark when I opened the bedroom door and crept down the hallway. The house was asleep. Even the thermostat hadn't clicked on yet. I moved through the quiet as I always had, with practiced care, as if the floorboards knew my steps and resented them. In the kitchen, I turned on just the stove light, brewed coffee in silence, and sat at the table alone. Amy would wake around 7, Jason a little later if he didn't have an early call. The kids came last, blinking sleep from their eyes and tossing cereal on the floor. But I didn't wait for any of them, not today. Instead, I took my coffee back to my room, and I opened the closet. The suitcase was dusty. I wiped it down with an old pillowcase and laid it open on the bed. It felt strange at first, packing, like I was pretending to leave. But I wasn't pretending. I folded my sweaters with care. I packed 2 pairs of pants, 1 dress, my walking shoes, and the wool scarf I bought in Santa Fe 10 years ago and hadn't worn since. I added the framed photo of me and my sister, not because I needed it, but because I knew no one would think to save it. I left my wedding album. I didn't need to take ghosts. It took only 20 minutes, years of my life, distilled into a carry-on. After that, I cleaned. Not because they'd notice, but because it's what I do. I wiped the countertops, emptied the trash, refilled the dog's water bowl. I even vacuumed under the couch. I washed the guest sheets and hung them to dry. I wanted the next person who slept there, if there ever was one, to lie down on something fresh. Then I sat at the kitchen table again. The light had changed by then. Morning had begun. Amy walked in first. She said, "Morning," without looking up from her phone. Jason followed a few minutes later, yawning and rubbing his neck. I poured juice for the children. I buttered toast. I handed out vitamins. Not a single question, not a single comment. They didn't notice the suitcase by the door. They didn't notice that I was dressed in clothes that weren't for cooking or gardening. They didn't notice that my purse, the one I rarely used, was zipped and resting on my lap. After breakfast, Amy hurried off to a meeting. Jason left with the kids. I was alone by 8:45. At 9 o'clock, the taxi pulled into the driveway. I had arranged everything the day before. Called an old acquaintance from church who now rented out a room in her home. She lived 10 minutes away, in a quiet cul-de-sac near the park. Her name was Shirley, and she'd lost her husband last winter. She was lonely. I would be company. It would be small, but it would be enough. I loaded the suitcase into the trunk myself. The driver didn't say much. I appreciated that. At Shirley's, we shook hands, then hugged. Her house smelled of cinnamon and cedar oil. She had flowers in a chipped blue vase on the table and a photo of her grandson in a frame that had lost one corner. The place was humble, quiet, and unremarkably perfect. We sat for an hour, sipping tea. She asked if I needed anything. I said no. That afternoon, I went back one last time. Not to stay. Just to finish what I had started. I returned to Jason's house with my key, unlocked the front door, and stepped into the same quiet I had always moved through. I washed the sheets I'd used the night before. I mopped the floor. I restocked the pantry shelf I had emptied. And before I left, I wrote a note, a plain slip of paper on the kitchen counter. I'm not cooking today. I'm choosing myself today. I folded the note in half, tucked it under the salt shaker, and left the key beside it. Then I left, and I didn't look back. It was still early when I closed the door behind me for the last time. The sky was gray but not heavy. A breeze stirred the wind chimes on the porch, a gentle metallic sound, like distant bells calling no one. The street was quiet, cars still parked, blinds drawn. I rolled my suitcase down the walk, each wheel click a small announcement. No one watched me go. I didn't expect them to. My phone was turned off. I had slipped it into my purse the night before and left it untouched. I wouldn't be taking calls, not today, maybe not for many days. The taxi arrived right on time. I asked the driver to take the long way, even though it cost more. I didn't want to rush. I wanted to feel the distance grow. At Shirley's, my room was simple: a twin bed by the window, a dresser with a missing knob, a lamp that buzzed when it was first turned on. There was a crocheted blanket folded at the end of the bed and a single framed photo on the wall of daisies in a mason jar. I set my suitcase down and didn't unpack. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands. They looked like my mother's now, knotted a bit at the joints, the skin thinner than it used to be. Strong hands still, capable, but no longer in service. I didn't cry. There was no cinematic relief, no sobbing into a pillow, just stillness. I sat for what felt like an hour, then stood, opened the window a little, and lay down. The silence was different here. Not empty, just mine. By noon, I had made tea and read a chapter from a novel I found on the shelf in the hallway. Shirley came home from the store with a box of scones and a fresh jug of milk. We sat at the kitchen table like old friends who'd only just remembered each other. I didn't mention Jason, or Amy, or the house. Shirley didn't ask. That evening, as the sky faded from pale blue to washed lavender, I took a walk. I passed a rosebush growing wild through a chain-link fence. I saw a pair of crows hop across a rooftop and vanish into the darkening trees. I counted my steps and didn't think about what anyone needed. I was not missed. Not at first. The first call came the next day, late in the afternoon. It rang twice and stopped. No message. The second came that evening, Jason. This time he left a voicemail. Hey, just checking in. Give us a call? I didn't. 3 days passed, then a text. Are you okay? Where are you? I didn't answer that either. I sat by the window and watched the rain collect on the sill. Shirley and I went to the market and bought vegetables. She taught me how to make lemon pie from scratch. We played cards at the kitchen table under the yellow light of the overhead lamp. 1 week passed, no more calls, no more messages. And that was when I knew. It wasn't that I had vanished, it was that they'd never really looked. 10 days passed. By then, I had memorized the creak of Shirley's hallway floor. I knew the pattern of sunlight through the lace curtain in the morning, how it made the wallpaper shimmer like water. I knew which cupboard stuck when you opened it too quickly, and I had started placing my slippers neatly by the door before bed. A new habit, just for me. I had been gone long enough that the silence felt normal, not heavy or anxious, just something I could breathe in. I started waking up without dread. I didn't flinch at the sound of footsteps. I didn't brace myself for the weight of another person's need as soon as I opened my eyes. Then, one evening, I checked my email. I hadn't meant to. I had turned on my phone only to take a photo of a tree I'd seen on my walk, one with a branch shaped like an outstretched hand. But the notifications pulled me in. There were 5 new emails from Jason. The first was dated 4 days after I left. Hi, Mom. We noticed you left a note, but we're not sure what's going on. Can you please call us? The second came the next day. Is this about the toast? I didn't mean anything by it. You've always been the rock in our family. Please just talk to us. I didn't respond. The third was shorter. Amy's worried. The kids are asking when Grandma's coming back. That one sat with me a little longer. The fourth message arrived 3 days later. There was no greeting. Are you okay? No signature. Just those 3 words. I stared at them for a while, reading them in different tones. Concerned, frustrated, perfunctory. I couldn't decide which. The fifth email was the most honest. Are you really offended by that toast? No apology, no curiosity about the silence that had been growing in me long before that evening. Just bewilderment that I had broken the pattern. I closed the laptop. Shirley was humming in the next room, folding towels. She had no idea what kind of storm had just rippled through me, and I didn't offer to explain. I didn't want sympathy. I didn't want to be told I was right. What I wanted, finally and simply, was to not be asked to return to a life that treated my value like a utility bill, noticed only when unpaid. That night, I wrote a reply in my head, not one I'd send, just one I needed to say to myself. No, Jason, I'm not offended by the toast. I'm heartbroken that it took that moment for you to realize I was even there. I'm not punishing you. I'm not making a statement. I just can't live where I'm invisible anymore. You grew up in a house where I made your favorite meals, where I stayed up through your fevers, where I walked to school in the rain with your forgotten project. I did it with love, not expectation. But somewhere along the line, the love stopped being noticed and just became expected. I didn't leave because of one dinner. I left because I stopped recognizing the version of myself who stayed. The next morning, I deleted the emails, not out of anger, out of clarity. If they wanted to understand, they could come and ask. They could look, they could listen. But I wouldn't beg to be seen. I wouldn't correct the silence with more work. That week, I bought a small notebook. On the front, I wrote, "Things just for me." On the first page, I wrote, "Get a library card." On the second, "Join a lecture at the community center." On the third, "Find a red blouse." Not for a dinner, for the museum. That day, I went to the bakery and bought a croissant. I ate it outside on a bench while watching 2 teenagers argue about whether a squirrel had stolen their lunch. For the first time in a long time, I laughed out loud, and nobody needed me to explain why. It was a Thursday, 2 weeks and 1 day since I'd left, when I realized I hadn't been bracing myself. I woke up not to the crash of cereal bowls or the slap of tiny feet on the hardwood floor, but to the soft murmur of the radio drifting in from the kitchen. Shirley was already up. I could smell coffee and something buttery. There were no alarms, no shouted reminders about backpacks or permission slips, no passive sighs about how early it was for a second load of laundry. Just a calm morning. I lay there for a moment under the light quilt with faded flowers and stared at the ceiling. There were faint cracks above me, like fine webs. I counted them. I didn't have to leap out of bed. There was no list in my head, no meals to prep, no invisible expectations gathering around the edge of the day. I stood slowly, wrapped myself in the shawl my sister had knitted me long ago, and made my way to the kitchen. Shirley was pouring coffee. She smiled and asked if I wanted honey or sugar. She asked me by name. Loretta, how do you feel about lemon in your tea later today? I found some at the farmer's stand. I smiled. Sounds lovely. We ate breakfast at the small round table. Just the two of us, without television or phones, without distractions. We talked about a documentary she wanted to watch, something about old lighthouses along the coast. We decided to make a day of it, watch the film, then go for a walk, maybe stop by the little secondhand bookstore on Maple. I hadn't planned anything like that in years. In my old life, I was needed constantly. But not like this. There, my usefulness was measured by output. Meals made, shirts ironed, tantrums soothed. Here, it was different. No one needed me to solve anything. I was just welcome. After breakfast, I changed into the blue cardigan I used to save for holidays and put on earrings I hadn't worn in months. Just small silver hoops. But they shimmered slightly in the morning light, and when I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror, I paused. I looked rested, not polished, not young, but whole. We spent the day as planned. The Lighthouse documentary made us both cry, though we pretended it was about the music. At the bookstore, I found a novel with a worn spine and a handwritten note tucked inside. For whoever needs a little hope. I bought it without even checking the price. Back at home, Shirley made soup. I set the table. She hummed something old and familiar, a tune I couldn't name but felt like childhood. That night, before bed, I sat by the window in my room and opened the new book. I didn't get very far, not because it was boring, but because the stillness was more interesting. Somewhere across town, I imagined Jason rushing through the evening. I saw Amy pulling off her heels and rubbing her temples, the kids negotiating bedtime, the dishwasher humming, maybe finally loaded by someone else. I wasn't there, and the world somehow still turned. It wasn't a dramatic revelation, no lightning strike, just a quiet, steady truth. My absence hadn't broken them, but my presence hadn't been honored either. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even disappointed anymore. I just understood. Sometimes what we give becomes expected, and what's expected becomes invisible. But here, with Shirley, with lemon in my tea and space in my day, I was beginning to feel seen, not needed, not praised, seen. And I think, no, I know, that was all I ever wanted. The shift was slow, but it came, like spring edging into a stubborn winter. I didn't notice the change in myself until I was standing in front of a mirror at the town thrift shop, holding a scarf I never would have worn before. Red, bright, unapologetic, and completely impractical. I draped it around my shoulders and laughed, not politely, actually laughed. Shirley peeked out from behind a rack of cardigans. That color suits you, she said. I bought the scarf, and a blouse, and a pair of silver earrings shaped like leaves. It wasn't about the items. It was about the moment, the choice. I wasn't dressing for the house. I wasn't picking things I could clean floors in. I was picking things because I liked them. That weekend, we went to a book reading at the community center. The author was a retired nurse who had written poetry about aging and dignity. Her voice trembled a bit, but her words hit like truth. I wrote some of them in my notebook. You can be a lighthouse. You don't have to be a lifeboat. I underlined it twice. I started a calendar. On the first page, I wrote, Loretta's Life. It was a joke at first, but every blank day I filled with something. Not chores, not errands, not obligations. Something for me. Tuesday, art walk downtown. Thursday, call Marcy, just to talk. Saturday, museum, ancient textiles exhibit. The pages filled quickly. There was no wash windows or pick up dry cleaning. No watch the kids while they go to the salon. Just the quiet architecture of a new life taking shape. I didn't tell anyone. Not Jason, not Amy, not the grandchildren. I knew they were still out there, probably managing, probably wondering, perhaps even adjusting. But I didn't owe them a report. One morning, I joined a lecture at the library about women's roles in post-war America. The speaker showed images of housewives from magazines, smiling, ironing, pouring coffee for men who read the paper. Everyone laughed gently. I didn't, because I had been that woman. I had smiled while pouring coffee, smiled while being overlooked, smiled until it no longer reached my eyes. After the talk, I stayed behind and chatted with a woman named Evelyn. She wore chunky rings and walked with a cane she'd painted herself. She invited me to a knitting group. I didn't knit. I said yes anyway. Change is like that. It doesn't ask if you're ready. It just gives you the next small door. You only have to step through. Back at Shirley's, I started helping with the garden. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I like the feel of the soil under my nails, the simplicity of planting something and watching it grow. Sometimes Shirley and I would sit on the porch in the late afternoon, sipping iced tea, talking about nothing urgent. I would reach up and adjust my scarf, the red one, and think about how long it had been since I felt beautiful, not in the way others declare, but in the way I carried myself, quietly, proudly, without apology. I didn't miss the house. I missed the children sometimes. I missed the way they used to run to me when they were little, arms open, before they were taught to see me as infrastructure. But I didn't miss the life that made me small. One Sunday, I baked a pie from scratch, just because I wanted the kitchen to smell like cinnamon. Shirley and I ate it warm, with tea, at 3 in the afternoon. No special occasion. No family dinner to prepare. No holiday that required effort I wouldn't be thanked for. It felt like a ceremony anyway. The celebration of something new and quiet and mine. I started writing again, not memoirs, not a journal, just thoughts, pieces of story, memories that wanted a softer landing. The kind that used to flicker and fade by the time I finished doing the dishes. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I'd reread those lines and feel a flicker of someone I hadn't seen in years, a younger version of myself, full of voice and clarity, before service became identity. Change didn't come with fanfare, no big revelations, just a string of tiny decisions that slowly rewrote my place in the world. I was no longer their wallpaper. I was painting something of my own. It arrived on a Wednesday. I had just come back from the morning market, arms full of pears and a loaf of crusty bread, when I saw the envelope tucked into the side of the mailbox. No stamp. Hand delivered. Jason's handwriting. I held it for a long time before opening it. The paper was thick, the ink blue and slightly smudged. He hadn't typed it. That meant something, though I wasn't sure what yet. It was only one page. Mom, I don't really know how to start this. I've tried writing a dozen versions, deleted them all. I guess I'm wondering if you're really still upset about that toast. Amy said it wasn't meant the way it sounded. I thought I was saying something nice about women who hold it all together. You've always been that person. We didn't think you were unhappy. You never said anything. We just thought, that's how you are, always helping, always present. It felt normal, but now that you're gone, the house is quiet. Not peaceful, just off. The kids ask where you are. Amy's trying to make dinner, and it's fine, but it's not the same. I came home today and realized no one had folded the laundry, and for the first time, I noticed how many little things you just handled. I don't know if you're coming back, but I hope you're okay. Jason. I read it twice, then a third time. It wasn't a bad letter. It was even tender in parts. And yet, the question still lingered like the taste of something burned. Are you really upset about that toast? I folded the letter neatly and placed it inside my desk drawer, not to forget it, but because it didn't require a response, because it wasn't about the toast. It had never been about that one night, that one sentence. The toast was just the drop that disturbed the surface I had kept smooth for years. I had allowed myself to believe that being quiet meant being appreciated, that being useful meant being loved. But love isn't silent, and service isn't the same as belonging. I didn't feel vindicated reading the letter. I felt tired, not defeated, just older than I had admitted to myself, worn in the way women get when they've spent too long being the person who picks up the pieces without ever being asked how she's holding together. Later that day, I went for a walk. The weather was turning. You could feel autumn in the wind, that briskness that hinted at change whether you were ready for it or not. I passed a park where children were swinging. I watched a grandmother pushing a stroller and wondered if she, too, had folded a life into corners for the sake of everyone else. That evening, I wrote in my journal. It wasn't about the toast. It was about everything I agreed to without realizing I'd agreed. The meals, the errands, the patience, the way I disappeared in plain sight. I didn't want applause. I wanted eye contact. I wanted to be invited to sit, not assumed to be standing. I didn't write back to Jason. He knew where I was. He had my number. If what he needed was a list of chores he'd forgotten I was doing, he'd already gotten that lesson. But if he wanted to learn who I was outside of that, he'd have to come find me, and he'd have to start with something other than a question about his own discomfort. I tucked the journal away and set the table for two. Shirley was making soup again. She asked about my day. I told her everything, except the letter. Some things are better left to settle, like bread dough, or silence, or truth. Thanksgiving came and went. There was no invitation, no phone call, no, "Are you coming this year, Mom?" Just silence. I made a sweet potato casserole for Shirley and her niece, who stopped by with pumpkin pie and stories about her new job at the library. We lit candles. We said what we were grateful for. I said, quiet mornings. Shirley said, strong women. I didn't miss the noise. Christmas was the same. The city dressed itself in lights. Couples strolled downtown holding paper cups of cider. A man in a Santa suit waved from a corner. I passed a shop window with a mannequin in a red wool coat and thought, I could wear that. I didn't check my email. I didn't wait for an apology. The truth is, by then, I had stopped expecting one. New Year's Eve, I stayed in. Shirley had gone to bed early with a book and a mug of chamomile tea. I sat by the window, wearing my red scarf, watching the fireworks blink across the skyline. Somewhere across town, maybe in that too bright kitchen with the clock that ticked too loud, they were raising glasses again. Maybe Amy had cooked something from Pinterest. Maybe Jason made another toast. Maybe the words were different this time. But I wasn't there to hear them. Instead, I reached up to adjust the silver earrings I'd bought at the thrift shop, caught my reflection in the window, and smiled. I looked like myself, not the woman who once folded laundry in silence, not the woman who hovered at the stove while others laughed, not the woman whose name had faded into usefulness. Just Loretta, 66, quiet, whole. I didn't need to be seen by everyone, just by myself. And that night, I did something I never used to do. I stayed up until midnight, not to clean, not to prep, not to plan, but to simply be, to watch the clock change over, to feel time pass without chasing it. When the last firework fizzled, I whispered aloud, "Happy New Year, Loretta." No one replied, and that was perfectly fine, because sometimes the best speech isn't one made at a crowded table, wine glass raised, voice straining to be heard. Sometimes the best speech is silence, delivered on time and received by the one who needed it most.